So Andrea Bassi is the founder and CEO of Knowledge SRL, a consulting company exploring social, economic, and environmental complexity in informed decision-making for sustainability. Dr. Bassi is also an extraordinary professor of Systematics at Stellenbosch University in South Africa, a research fellow at the University of Geneva in Switzerland, and a senior associate at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. Dr. Bassi has 20 years of experience supporting close to 50 governments and several international organizations in the formulation and evaluation of green economy strategies and scenarios, climate mitigation, and adaptation and sustainable development strategies. Dr. Bassi routinely works at the national, sectoral, and asset level. Dr. Bassi's strengths lie primarily in the use of modeling and research techniques that focus on systems analysis, particularly systems thinking and system dynamics. Dr. Bassi holds a PhD and an MPhil in systems dynamics at the University of Bergen, Norway, Master of Science in Business and Economics at LIUC in Italy, and a postgraduate course in modeling the environment at the University Politecnica de Catalunya in Spain. I hope I did it okay. But Dr. Bassi is fluent in English and French, but actually his mother tongue is Italian. So Dr. Bassi, I'll hand over to you to take us through the role of system dynamics in the formulation of net zero plans.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I guess my presentation is as different as it can get from what we just heard from the previous presenter, which I hope makes it interesting and offers a way of comparing the work. I hope that you can see my PowerPoint. Please let me know whether the full screen is visible and the full slide is available on your screen as well.
It's visible and clearly.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So as anticipated, my presentation focuses on the extent to which system dynamics can help, at least in my experience, in the formulation of net zero plans. And in this case, we're mostly talking about national level policy. And for those of you familiar with climate mitigation or climate related studies, the COP, the Conference of the Parties, the 27th one, is ongoing at the moment in Egypt. And some of the work I'm presenting here is actually being released or has been discussed and shared in general at that event or in the previous years. So the presentation is really about development planning, national level, applied work based on research. So it's data-driven and science-based policy analysis, pretty much. So to set the context and clarify the reason for this type of work and why using system dynamics for this work, for those that have been involved in sustainable development, I think it has been fairly clear over the last 20 years that our understanding or the way in which we define sustainable development has actually changed, has evolved over time. We started from a more narrowly focused concept of we need to avoid negative outcomes. And then we are moving now to the need to transform the way in which the economy works, in which the economy supports society and so on and so forth, and not the other way around. And the needs of decision makers have also changed over time, meaning that they understand better what the challenges are at the moment, because there is more awareness of climate change. There is more awareness of the fact that our economies are all interconnected due to globalization. And I would say, in a way, the evolution in our thinking and understanding of sustainability has progressed faster than the improvements we've seen in simulation models in the vast majority of cases. If we think about energy supply models, they are very similar to the models today, to the models that we were using 15, 20 years ago. Not much has really changed. I would say marginal incremental improvements. But at the same time, our understanding of global challenges and national challenges has evolved considerably. So now, to take that understanding to the extreme, we're actually looking at net zero strategies, which means that we want to eliminate almost entirely emissions, CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, with the potential to do some offsets with land-based dynamics, but pretty much we want to go to zero emissions overall. And at the same time, we want to generate nature positive outcomes, meaning that we want to adapt to climate change, we want to strengthen the quality of ecosystems and ecological functions and so on and so forth. Now, I've seen, as I said before, that some methods and models have evolved over time, some others not so much. But it is in this context of the complexity that we are dealing with that I think system dynamics really shines. And to begin with, we have one critical feedback loop to analyze. And, you know, feedback loop, delays, nonlinearity are the foundations, the pillars of system dynamics. And already at the beginning of the discussion on sustainability, we see that there is a lot of discussion on low carbon development, where we have a low carbon component, which means that we have to reduce emissions, and we have a development component, meaning that we want to achieve economic growth, social empowerment, get out of the poverty trap or the middle income trap, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it is important to look at the interconnections between these two elements, low carbon and development, meaning that we want to understand how investments in emission reduction affects economic growth and development overall, and then the extent to which development, so economic growth, influences the potential to reduce emissions. Because think of it this way, if you're able to reduce emissions and that makes GDP grow, we are very happy. But then if GDP grows, and that means that we use more resources, more energy, we do more deforestation, that ultimately increases emissions. And so we're basically depicting a fairly strong balancing loop, which makes so that it will be more and more difficult to actually have lasting and strong emission reductions over time. So this is where, starting from causal loop diagrams, starting from the quantification of some of these variables in stock and flow models, can really help us gain that shared understanding of what we are up against to make so that we can define the right type of strategies and use the right level of ambition to achieve, you know, this absolute net zero emission target. So here is an example of a causal diagram that reflects the structure of a model called the green economy model. It is an evolution of the original green economy model that was also applied to South Africa. I think the first time of SAGEM, the South Africa Green Economy Model, was 2014, if I remember correctly. And it shows that there are a few key reinforcing loops and balancing loops at play, so not just the one I mentioned before. But on the one hand, we can see that when GDP grows, we have more consumption. Consumption drives economic growth. This is a critical reinforcing loop in the model. If we have more consumption, we extract natural resources, and that supports the primary sector, extractives, agricultural land, and so on. Also reinforcing. The more GDP grows, we go into the production sector, the secondary sector. We increase physical capital with the accumulation of investments, and that drives more economic activity on the supply side. The more investment and physical capital we have, the more employment we generate. That results in income and therefore economic growth, consumption, and so on and so forth. And then on the public side, if we go towards the tertiary sector, services, and the knowledge economy, we see the more GDP grows, the more public expenditure can go into health, education, professional training. So the basic services that allow us to create that knowledge economy, that is basically an improvement in labor productivity because of innovation, because of new ideas that we have, that we bring to the table, higher value services, and so on and so forth, which ultimately increases productivity and economic growth. So we see that all the feedback loops I mentioned so far are reinforcing feedback loops, and they reflect what we call neoclassical economic theory. But then if we expand the analysis, we see that the very drivers of growth are also the ones that create problems, meaning that the more we grow with GDP, the more we consume, the more we extract natural resources, the more we run out of natural capital. We basically use, extract, and run out of resources. That leads to a reduction of ecosystem services. It leads to ecological scarcity, so an increase in ecological scarcity, which ultimately affects the price of raw materials, reducing economic productivity. And when we lose ecosystem services, we need to invest to replace them. So we have a suboptimal use of resources that could be spent in other areas that are more productive. So we see the emergence of balancing loops, B1, B2, B3 on the natural side. And this is more of a locally driven set of dynamics. We then also have greenhouse gas emissions as a result of consumption and energy demand, and as a result of the reduction of natural capital, which increase climate vulnerability. Also a local dynamic based on the fact that we are reducing our adaptive capacity, our resilience is declining because we get rid of this natural infrastructure that makes us more resilient. But then also at the same time, if you have emissions, another local impact, we reduce human health, or we have a negative consequence on human health, which ultimately undermines reinforcing loop number 5 because it tends to reduce labor productivity. So we see that there are certain drivers of growth that over time have started triggering and strengthening balancing loops. And we are at the stage now where it takes really a lot of money, a lot of resources to make the economy grow, because it's an economy that costs a lot to maintain. And this is not going to change anytime soon if you consider climate change impacts, if you look at value chain disruptions as a result of COVID, changes in energy prices and food trade, for instance, as a result of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So we are creating some of these crises that may be temporary, but there is this underlying trend that is worrying at the global level. Now, this is even more visible if, adding a second key feature of system dynamics, when we look at stocks and flows, we look at the performance of the stocks, the accumulation of physical capital, how that has resulted to an increase in employed population, how investments in education have resulted in human capital creation, and then the changes we see in natural capital. As you can well imagine, picking any country you can think of, we have had an imbalanced performance of these stocks. In some areas, we've had a lot of physical capital accumulation and employment creation, but reduction of natural capital and not so much improvement of human capital. In other contexts, we have physical capital, not so much employment, if it's high-tech related employment, mechanized and so on and so forth, but human capital is very high and good. Natural capital, on the other hand, lags behind. And in areas where we have a lot of natural capital, that seems to be a trade-off where physical capital should not increase too much. Otherwise, we end up using finite resources and converting land and so on and so forth. So clearly there is something that is off in the way in which we manage and handle these different stocks. Now, how is this model, the green economy model, but also system dynamics in my own work being applied to support these net zero strategies, starting from the fact that there are underlying feedback loops that we need to take into account. So one example, starting with causal loop diagrams, is at the regional level. This is work done to support the European Environment Agency in basically assessing the extent to which the European Green Deal, which aims at fully going to net zero by 2050, affects development overall at the EU level. Now, this causal diagram was also then used to inform the parameterization and analysis of results of a CGE model, a computable general equilibrium model of the macroeconomy, basically of the EU countries. But it was not quantified. There are examples of quantification later on. Here is the causal diagram that was developed for that program, quite similar to the one I showed before. We also have GDP, we have consumption, we have production. The more GDP we have, the more investment and income creation. But then we see that in this more developed context of the European Union, we see more income resulting in more mobility, resulting in congestion in cities, air pollution, the emergence of societal costs, and the potential reduction in GDP growth. We see production resulting in waste generation, water pollution, which ultimately impact food quality, and goes on to affect societal costs again. So the same type of approach, some reinforcing loops driving economic growth, primary, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, but then also balancing loops being driven or representing societal costs. A bit different, congestion, pollution, and so on, but nevertheless relevant for these type of countries. Now, if you look at other examples at the national level, we can go a bit more into detail and be more specific. Several examples of projects done in the last few years with the UN Environment Programme, work done in the Latin America and the Caribbean region, Costa Rica, Panama, for instance, to assess how national policy, say energy policy, can support national decarbonization goals. With the Global Green Growth Institute, we have done projects in Ethiopia and Burkina Faso on the update of the nationally determined contributions and the low emission development strategy. Ethiopia has launched the updated LEDs yesterday, actually, at the COP. And then also at the national level with the World Resources Institute, but then also with AROA, a recently formed international organization. We have been looking at how to finance net zero plans, how to raise ambition about decarbonization for climate prosperity and similar type of processes. Meaning changing the narrative to let's address an issue to, well, maybe this is an opportunity. Let's work at creating this opportunity for the future. But I wanted to mention a few of the country cases to show you that this is happening everywhere worldwide, regardless of the continent, regardless of the organization that supports the work. There is actually a trend that I think is strengthening over time as to increasing the ambition for these type of strategies and plans. Now, to give you an idea of the value provided by system dynamics in this case, this is a slide that presents the scenarios created for Costa Rica. We see on the left side, what are the main indicators? We look at power generation, we look at buildings, We consider waste management, agriculture, livestock, and forestry. So at the outset, you can see this is not a one sector model. This is really a model that includes different sectors, several strategies within each of the sectors to create that systemic view. So the value of system dynamics here is not going into depth within sectors, but it is to connect the sectors to one another. Higher level of aggregation, I would say, overall, compared to other sectoral models, but nevertheless, that cross-sectoral relationship being explicit. Now, when it comes to the outcomes generated in this specific case, the impact that you see on the right side, we start from here, is employment creation. So this is where we have calculated the amount of jobs that can be obtained from investing in solar panels, wind farms, reforestation. So each of the sectors starts being estimated with physical indicators so that we can look at labor intensity and estimate the actual number of jobs created in each of the sectors. And then we compare that amount of jobs created with the investment implemented over time between now and 2050. Again, system dynamics can help on this because it allows you to connect physical indicators with economic indicators. If you use a CG model for the economy, it's purely economic. It doesn't measure number of jobs. It measures the corresponding income. So it gives you different information. Now, on the left side instead, we have results on the economic viability of the strategy and individual investments, meaning that the number you see at the top here is the basically dollar of return per dollar invested. So that by 2050, in this specific scenario, the most ambitious one for decarbonization, we see close to $6 of return for each dollar invested. And again, allowing the system to digest investments and accumulate benefits all the way to 2050. But then you see also these colored bars, which correspond to the contribution of each of the indicators that you see down here, including both added benefits and avoided costs. And that is very important. System dynamics models like the green economy model do not only look at drivers of growth, meaning that if you grow, then you can finance environmental preservation and so on and so forth. They capture at the same time the drivers of growth and cost items, meaning that we can show that there is benefit from reducing the cost of running the economy. For instance, we can run different climate scenarios, make assumptions about policies that would improve climate resilience, planting trees in urban areas so that they reduce stormwater runoff and damage to roads and buildings. That generates an avoided cost. And that avoided cost, in a way, is a benefit. If we think about the fact that every dollar saved is a dollar earned, then there is a one-to-one comparison between what you save and what you generate as additional value. Similar example for Panama, we have a number of different investments, power generation, we have energy efficiency, we have electric vehicles. There are many more that were added that are not in this specific image. And then you see different scenarios. This is another key feature of system dynamics models that I use very often. The green economy model and most system dynamics models are not designed to optimize, meaning that we run simulation. We let the model run free. In a way, we want to see what happens if the strategy of the government is implemented. What are the consequences? If something goes wrong in the short term, I want the model to show that. I don't want the model to re-optimize performance and figure out what is the best way out of that issue. I want my government counterparts to realize what the problem is so that they learn from this experience and design a stronger policy package. That stronger policy package I can re-simulate again. Now, the advantage, as I said, is that we can run different scenarios with different levels of ambitions or compositions of policy packages, show them the results. And if you don't optimize with a software like Vensim, you can run a new scenario in no more than 1 second for 50 or 70 years of simulation. So during a meeting, I show the results. We are there face-to-face or online. They provide feedback immediately as to what is a reasonable, good outcome, what should be changed based on the performance that we see on the screen here or for other indicators. And we adjust the simulations and run them again. So that is also very important. Another critical factor I see at the national level that is important is the extent to which we can capture adaptation to climate change. We can build in system dynamics models, given that they use semi-continuous simulation with, for instance, monthly time steps. We can add climate forecasts. Monthly data on precipitation, on temperature, on evapotranspiration when it comes to agricultural production, so that we can capture seasonality, the change of seasons over time, meaning climate change may push the rainy season further ahead by a few weeks or a month or more, or backwards, depending on the region. And that may have a strong impact on some crops and not on others. Extreme events is also something we can capture. So in this case, you can see for Honduras, we were able to integrate, based on other available work, of course, impacts on healthcare, education, buildings, transport, the tourism sector, energy infrastructure, for instance, distribution, and so on and so forth. So there are many, many different factors that we were able to integrate there. Now, how is this done? Again, another key feature here is that we can soft couple a system dynamics model that looks at a country perspective or a subnational perspective with spatially explicit models. In this case, we use the INVEST suite of models, the integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs developed by the Natural Capital Project, to see overall across the country what would be the impact of different climate scenario on runoff, so water runoff and the retention potential based on different land cover classes, the amount of water yield that you will get under different scenarios, but also carbon storage and habitat quality. So basically what we do in this case with the model, with the system dynamics model, is that we forecast trends to 2050 for different types of land cover, forest land, agriculture, settlement land, fallow land. And then we use spatial models to basically create a future land cover map, distribute these hectares of land cover change on the map. And then we take the results of these analyses for habitat quality, carbon storage, and so on, and we feed it back into the system dynamics model. So that despite being a national model, it has the granularity, it is calibrated according to the impacts that you will get when using a fully spatially explicit analysis. So it makes it more realistic and more useful in a way. Now, the stock and flow dimension is also very important when it comes to financing. Meaning that we use it in different cases to figure out if you want to have money available for achieving your net zero target by 2050, you may actually have to invest now a certain amount, and you may have to collect money for the investment you have now in the short term, but also you may have to collect money for the investments that will come in the future. Think of a carbon tax. The carbon tax can be collected up to the point where we consume fossil fuels. If we introduce a carbon tax in 2040, and in the meantime, we have started reducing the consumption of fossil fuels because we have a target for decarbonization by 2050, that policy will not be effective. So we are able to explain how to prioritize intervention options based on the stock and flow accumulation principles. Now, up to this stage, we look at regional dynamics, national dynamics. Now we want to offer some thoughts about how system dynamics can help at the sectoral level. And this is where we go deeper into sectors and policies at the same time. With the Green Climate Fund, we have developed sector guides explaining how to prepare a concept for a project on health and well-being that takes into account social, economic, and environmental indicators. So basically the health co-benefits across the board of climate action. With the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the Global Subsidy Initiative, we developed more detailed modeling work on energy demand and potential for fuel switching in relation to national policies. Fossil fuel subsidy removal in this case, in the context of the national determined contributions. And then more work has been done also with the World Health Organization on assessing, again, the co-benefits of climate action on health dynamics. So basically concentration of pollutants, morbidity, mortality for different people at different age, in different age brackets, with different income generation potential, to estimate how much the government should be willing to invest in relation to the cost avoided that these interventions would generate. Now, here is just a graphical representation of how the second example, the subsidy removal model, works. Fairly straightforward. We calculate indicated demand using an initial demand value. We apply GDP growth rates, population growth rates, assumptions on technology adoption, and then we single out the price effect. This is where we take the energy price. We look at estimating a price elasticity, normally from literature as a starting point, check that that price elasticity allows us to match historical trends of demand, and then we remove subsidies and possibly increase taxation based on carbon taxation, so that we have a price effect that leads to substitution, going from the more carbon-intensive energy options to the least carbon-intensive energy options. And then we collect resources that can be reallocated either to improve energy efficiency or to stimulate a renewable energy use. So changing basically final demand by energy source. When these dynamics are considered, then we go to CO2 emissions calculations. Now, what is interesting in this case is that we can break down the contribution of each of these sub-provisions in the policy. We can see how much emission reduction you get from removing fossil fuel subsidies alone. Here we're in the range of 6% or so by the full removal, and this is an assessment done over 32 countries. Then if we start adding the reinvestment of the subsidy savings, we can see that instead of having a temporary improvement and then we are stable, the reinvestment every year of the avoided subsidy given allows us to increase the installed capacity of renewable energy and energy efficiency. And that leads to a growing amount of avoided emissions over time. So that 6% initial removal from subsidies can be leveraged to get up to about 18% of emissions removal by 2040 in 20 years in these 32 countries. So again, this highlights the extent to which there is potential to create a synergy, which I think is very useful from system dynamics models, as well as to understand the concept of accumulation over time. The more you stick to the plan, the more you can accumulate the benefits if you have a policy that is well designed. And in this case, subsidy removal is not free, but almost free, meaning that other studies indicate that close to 30% of the subsidy saving could be reallocated to low-income families to minimize the negative impact at that level, but that the remaining 70% could be actually reused for energy efficiency and renewable energy. We assume 50% in this graph that you see here, or to reduce public deficit, if that is a more pressing concern. Now, next, we have looked at regional, national, sectoral, and then we go to asset level and landscape level. So this is where we start looking at specific projects, specific infrastructure assets, and meaning that if we see infrastructure as an enabler for sustainability and for reaching net zero, we want infrastructure to be sustainable in the first place and reduce emissions as much as possible. And so this is where we started looking at nature-based infrastructure, for instance. Also in South Africa, also in Cape Town and Johannesburg, mostly for stormwater management and for wastewater management. These are the two main areas analyzed so far in Cape Town and Joburg. And what we want to do in this case is to expand the conventional analysis that is done for the investments to make sure that we can capture the broader set of benefits. Now, we'll show you in this case the analysis done for Islamabad. So this is for Pakistan. Again, system dynamics coupled with maps, but the more interesting sort of outcome in this case would be maps. We looked at two scenarios here. What if we plant trees as a nature-based infrastructure option outside of the city? So this is the area, the city area. This is the standard initial land cover map. And on the right side, you see the land cover map with trees. Here at the bottom in blue, you see the areas where more trees had been planted, just the net difference between the two maps. Then we see that potentially there is a strong impact on flood mitigation that leads to $50 million of net savings based on the ambition of planting trees in this case. So we spend 6 million, 6.5 million, you get 50 million back in return. At the same time, if we change the strategy, same investment, but in this case, we plant trees inside the city with a different goal, not flood mitigation, so not at the edge of the city, but in this case, it's for urban cooling to reduce the heat island effect, extreme heat impact on population. And then we see again the two land cover maps on the left side. And here on the right side, we see maps that look at areas with extreme heat. So the red area here in this map shows that temperature will be very high, above 40 degrees during the hottest months. And down here in blue, you actually see the areas that become cooler because we have vegetation. So there is a lot less red area in this case. And here again, we compare the investment very similar to the size that we looked at before, 6.5 million. We plant the same number of trees to make sure that there is comparability. And in this case, we see avoided impacts on human health, diarrhea, for instance, but also more. For instance, we look at the fact that reducing temperature stimulates the use of walking, cycling, non-motorized transport, or public transportation as well. So it creates a synergy with new investments. Now, this is, of course, a net zero type of intervention option because we're not building a wall, a flood-related wall of concrete in the first case, and we're not introducing air conditioning or something similar in the city center. So it's really nature-based, and so it's sustainable in the first place, and then it contributes to the creation of another set of co-benefits. Now, what are the common elements that we have observed across the board? This regional, national, sectoral, and then asset or location-specific landscape level. So on the one hand, it's the possibility to create that integrated economic analysis. We start with physical indicators, be it with maps or land cover change and so on and so forth, in the systemnomics model, being actual number of jobs. But we always start with these physical indicators, meaning that the economic analysis is well grounded on what is realistic. And at the same time, by linking together these social, economic, and environmental indicators together, we are able not only to look at the impact on traditional indicators, but we do an assessment of the societal value of the investment, which allows us then to bring in all these externalities, all those variables that do not really have a market value in reality, right? They don't lead to any cash flow. So this assessment can then be done, if we take it to the societal level, for an investment, for a policy package, for a development plan. It doesn't matter. It can be done across the board. And the main difference that I would see is that under a baseline scenario and under a low emission or net zero scenario, normally we tend to use like the same exact indicators. We have the investment, we calculate the benefits, we get the net result. On the other hand, in reality, if we take a baseline scenario, the conventional investment can generate benefits, but it may also generate costs, like health costs, resulting from pollution and so on and so forth. On the other hand, in a low emission scenario, in a net zero scenario, that investment is normally going to reduce costs. And that's where is the main difference. Not only looking at direct and indirect benefits, but actually checking how the costs are being impacted. Again, the goal in this case is to make sure that we look at ways of increasing performance, but also ways of reducing wasteful spending or impacts we create for the economy. And often this is the type of outcome that we get. It's a big table. In this case, it compares different countries and their net zero plans, but we have at the top all the investments we consider, and then we have avoided costs. Some are tangible, like avoided energy spending. Some are intangible, like the annual social cost of carbon. And then we have the added benefits, potential contributions to income creation or to GDP, so to economic activity overall, so that ultimately we can determine that benefit to cost ratio with different discounting rates and so on and so forth. But in a way, as you can see, we have an analysis that speaks to those that work on employment, those that work on land cover change and ecosystems, those that work on financing because we provide the investment value. And they all have a say in assessing, understanding, evaluating this integrated analysis that is presented here. Of course, for an economic-oriented audience, a Minister of Finance, this may be the starting point, the cost-benefit analysis. But if I'm talking to the Minister of Environment, I do not start with the cost-benefit analysis. I start with the physical impacts on the indicators that are relevant to them. So overall, concluding, I think that when we look at net zero, nature-positive plans, but also circular economy, climate adaptation and mitigation brought together, well-being economy, they all require a systemic approach. And that's the perfect sweet spot for system dynamics in a way. What I often do is to say that we bring coherence to the discussion. We may start from a causal diagram, a 2-hour, 3-hour co-creation exercise. That already sets the stage very well, giving the idea that we are not bringing a model that substitutes other models. We are bringing a tool that complements other more detailed knowledge that may be available at the country or at the local level. And then what is really innovative that I see is the assessment of the changing dominance of feedback loops. That gives rise to emerging dynamics in the future, not because of something we do, but mostly because of something we do not do. Like during a scenario of inaction, if you see new dynamics emerging, that's really what is seen as a surprising aspect from most of the people I've worked with in the past. They expect the future to be a linear extrapolation of the past, but that is not necessarily the case, of course. And then if you use that co-creation approach, if you're transparent in sharing the model, run the simulations in front of the clients, which is more of a software feature rather than system dynamics feature, then it really supports that co-creation of the strategy, which ultimately makes so that there is a sense of ownership being created and empowerment for the local decision makers. So it's not my model that I bring as a consultant. This becomes the model of the team that I've worked with, basically gathering knowledge from them, translating it into a model, and then giving them back the results of their own thinking, their own work. This is something that I've not seen very often happening with other models besides system dynamics models, because there is less room for customization, less room for integrating the knowledge of the local team into the actual model framework, because it's more fixed, it's more difficult to modify, especially in relation to data gaps and so on and so forth. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Bassi. This is a very insightful presentation. We have a question in the chat. Maybe I can ask Nalini, do you mind speaking the question, or would you want me to read it?
I don't mind actually asking the question. The one thing I must agree with you on as well is that there's a huge difference when you identify what we call a custodian and an owner of the model. So the custodian is the high-level executive that actually wants to have this model built for the area. But then the owner of the model, we train them up to be able to run the scenarios, and literally we've had them even present to our the rest of the customers, and that buy-in is what also helps to ensure that the models are sustained. But that was an aside. My actual question then is, in terms of the waste management strategies, are people actually looking at things like your renewable waste, like your solar panel waste, your wind turbine blades, your lithium-ion batteries for reuse, refurbishment, as opposed to just recycling it, and all of that to support that green economy, the circular economy business model that you also mentioned? Is there
so in general, on batteries, yes, that comes up all the time. The life cycle approach, where the material is coming from, and whether that creates even more of a problem on supply chains and so on and so forth, and what to do at the end of their lifetime. But not so much for solar panels and wind turbines and so on. That doesn't come up very often. At times, it's myself and colleagues, we push the boundaries and say, what about this? What about that? But I would say the genuine request to include these inputs in the model, not very frequent. 9 times out of 10, there is no request to look into these dynamics.
We also found that. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry to hear. Good, but also sorry to hear.
Thank you, Lily, for that question and the confirmation, Dr. Bassi. Andries, can I ask you to unmute and ask your question, please?
Sure, Corné. So my question, it's a very cynical approach to this, but when a government starts taxing something like carbon, and they use your carbon emissions as an indicator of how much they tax you, the moment you start reducing it, this money that they used to get in and they now realize they're not getting in anymore, now they try and recover it, and they either do it by giving you other taxes or they raise the taxes on what you've already tried to save. So, then if you look from a business perspective, I think sometimes businesses just go cynical and say that, I'm not going to make a difference. I'm not going to make the change because I know they're just going to tax me again.
Yeah, it's a good point. That's why in the type of assessments I do, most of the time, I try to connect the sources of revenue, say for the government, to the financing strategy, but then also the ways in which we can reduce other cost items, other budgetary items, to say, maybe you don't need to collect new money. Maybe if you work more effectively, you can reallocate, repurpose some of your spending. Like, for instance, if you're expecting that respiratory diseases will decline, human health will improve, then maybe the budget for the health sector could be reduced so that you can reallocate some of that budget to other areas, like supporting the use and adoption of efficient appliances or energy efficiency improvements overall. But what you say is a concern, meaning that I worked already 3 years ago with the European Union, and they were looking at the fact that if they're actually going to achieve the environmental targets they have, a lot of the environment or pollution-related taxation will disappear. At the same time, they're dealing with an aging population that requires more support on the pension side and so on. And we're leaning towards a reduction in labor intensity for the economy because of mechanization. So they see reduced income taxes because employment is becoming smaller in relation to the size of the population, increased costs to support the aging population, and at the same time, less potential revenue accumulation from taxing pollution. So how are they going to deal with this, with fiscal pressure and so on and so forth? Then, COVID came and money was printed out of nowhere, but then that problem went away temporarily, but it remains an issue. I agree.
I'm so glad
I have to say,
I'm so glad it's not just a developing world problem.
Oh, no, absolutely. I have to say, I mostly work with developing countries in general, but I'm yet to see a country or one ministry that says, hey, look, my performance is going to improve, and let me give you some of my resources, right? That for the good of the country. That has never happened so far in my experience. I guess it will take a little bit longer.
Thank you so much, Andrea. This is very interesting. I think I feel a little bit intimidated to see the amount of work and understanding you have of these systems, and I think we all appreciate you taking some time and reflecting with us what you're experiencing. There's a lot to learn. I think if you have more questions, please do contact Dr. Andreas. I think there's a lot of amazing things we can still learn. I want to applaud you. Can you please give an applause to Dr. Bassi, and then I'm going to ask the next presenter to start taking stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much.